Chronology of unfriendly policies and acts pursued by previous U.S. administrations. Home articles general. Chronology of unfriendly policies and acts pursued by previous U.S. administrations. General. Last updated May 4, 2023. The profound misunderstanding that characterizes US-Eritrean ties does not emanate, as is often insinuated, from substantive differences on events surrounding the war in Somalia in 2006. It predates this singular episode. Indeed, since the 1950s, when overriding U.S. strategic interests compromised Eritrea's right of decolonization, successive U.S. administrations have invariably propped up Ethiopian colonial presence in Eritrea. U.S. principal responsibility in stifling Eritrea's right of decolonization in the 1950s to promote its global strategic interests with the advent of the Cold War. Its huge military support, including the training of local, counter-insurgency forces, to the imperial Haile Selassie regime. Its less prominent support to the Mengistu regime in spite of the latter's undeniable alliance with the Soviet Union. And its opposition, until the 11th hour, to Eritrea's legitimate struggle for liberation are indeed matters of indisputable historical record. The human and opportunity costs that these policies entailed to the Eritrean people, who had to pay the huge price of more than 65,000 deaths in combat of their best sons and daughters, is too evident to merit emphasis. Following liberation, the government of Eritrea chose to forgive and forget, to close the dark chapter, and to begin on a new slate by fostering a new relationship of cooperation and friendship. This was reciprocated by the U.S. administrations, and bilateral relations were good until 1998. However, when Ethiopia declared war against Eritrea on 14 May 1998, and as Ethiopian jet fighters attacked Eritrea's capital, Asmara, on 5 June 1998, the then U.S. Assistant Secretary of State for Africa broke diplomatic precedents to directly address the OAU summit in Ouagadougou in support of Ethiopia and to lobby the OAU to adopt a resolution against Eritrea. In July the same year, President Clinton brokered a moratorium on air strikes between Eritrea and Ethiopia. Eritrea's declared preference was for a comprehensive cessation of hostilities. But the Clinton administration insisted on a partial arrangement, arguing that Ethiopia was not prepared to contemplate a comprehensive truce. Ethiopia abused the window of peace to purchase Su-27 jet fighters, mostly with Western financial support. And on 6 February 1999, it launched a new military offensive against Eritrea by fabricating Eritrea's air bombardment of Adigrat, a town in northern Ethiopia. The U.S. authorities were fully aware of, and ascertained without a shred of doubt, Ethiopia's bogus justification and its flagrant breach of the moratorium on air strikes. Still, they abstained from taking appropriate remedial action. The United States nonetheless continued to facilitate the peace talks in conjunction with the European Union and the OAU. In the course of the tortuous negotiating process, the U.S. facilitators came up, in September 1999, with a detailed final document known as the Technical Arrangements. This agreement was submitted to the parties as a take it or leave it package. Both parties accepted the document and pledged to be bound by its provisions. Soon after, Eritrea learned that Ethiopia had not accepted the agreement in good faith and was only biding time to launch another war. Subsequently, Eritrea's head of state conveyed this information to the highest authorities in Washington, who reassured Eritrea that Ethiopia would face severe consequences should this turn out to be the case. As it happened, Ethiopia declared the peace process in terminal phase, and launched the third offensive on 12 May 2000. The U.S. administration backtracked on its commitments and only nudged the UN Security Council to impose military sanctions on both the guilty and aggrieved parties. The U.S. also extended, both directly and mostly through convenient proxies, military support to Ethiopia during the war. Although the government of Eritrea has not to date disclosed fully the information at its disposal, U.S. intelligence agencies were further embroiled, at the height of Ethiopia's third offensive in May 2000, in instigating acts of sedition and treason, including attempted liaison with Ethiopia, within a small ring of senior government officials. In 2001, Eritrean diplomats in Washington were deprived of the diplomatic privileges on tax exemption in contravention of the provisions of the 1961 Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations. Eritrea did not take reciprocal action, and U.S. diplomats continue to enjoy their tax exemption privileges. In June 2003, Eritrea was omitted from the list of East African countries slated to receive US funding for counterterrorism barely 3 months after its inclusion, and while at the same time retaining Eritrea's membership in the Coalition of the Willing. In October 2003, a visiting military team of the U.S. task force based in Djibouti, CJTF-HOA, assisted the unlawful departure of an Eritrean citizen to Djibouti aboard its helicopter in violation of the domestic laws of the country. In 2003, the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom, USCIRF, published its annual Religious Freedom Report accusing the government of Eritrea for violation of religious freedom. In February 2004, the U.S. administration designated Eritrea a country of particular concern, and imposed sanctions on military sales. In December 2003, President Bush announced the cancellation of Eritrea's membership to AGOA, barely 2 years after its inclusion. Since 2004, the U.S. has continued to reject the right of, an expressed request by, Eritrea to purchase property in New York for the residence of its permanent representative to the United Nations. On 13 April 2004, U.S. Homeland officers raided the Eritrean Community Center in Washington, D.C. and confiscated money and documents forcefully from the Eritrean diplomatic agent at gunpoint. In spite of Eritrea's repeated requests and in violation of the Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations, the U.S. government continues to refuse returning the embassy property. In September 2004, Eritrea's Minister of Foreign Affairs was strip-searched by U.S. security officers at the airport in New York. At various times since 2003, the U.S. Embassy in Asmara intentionally delayed or refused to issue entry visas for numerous Eritrean senior government officials who sought to leave for the USA for official business. Officials denied visas include senior government ministers, PFDJ officials and even musical groups for concerts at festivals of Eritrean communities in the U.S. In January 2006, the U.S. Assistant Secretary of State visited the occupied Eritrean town of Badme through Ethiopia and without the knowledge and authorization of Eritrea. In doing so, Ms. Fraser not only sanctioned Ethiopia's occupation of a sovereign Eritrean town, but to add insult to injury, she proposed that a referendum be held to decide the future of Badme. In November 2006, the U.S. ambassador to Eritrea demanded that the Ministry of Labor and Human Welfare pay $4.5 million for food aid donated to the needy by 2 NGOs, Mercy Corps and Catholic Relief Services, and that was utilized in accordance with the food monetization policy. Similarly, the U.S. administration had previously demanded that Eritrea pay for food aid destined to Ethiopia and that perished in the port of Assab in 1998 when the regime in Addis Ababa declared war and boycotted the port. In November 2006, U.S. authorities imposed travel restrictions on Eritrean embassy members and the dependents in Washington and Oakland. Ever since, State Department officials almost routinely reject most of the travel requests by the ambassador and other Eritrean diplomats beyond the 25 kilometers limit. Although the Eritrean government issued the requested visa to the U.S. Embassy's new visa officer in Asmara, the U.S. Embassy nonetheless informed the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in November 2006 that, effective December 4, 2006, non-immigrant visa services will be temporarily suspended due to staffing shortages. Non-immigrant visa services will resume as soon as staff are granted permission to travel to Eritrea to provide this service. This notice, that was posted in website the same day, remains effective until today, and Eritreans who wish to visit their relatives in the U.S. have to travel to Nairobi or Cairo to apply for entry visas, which is not always granted. In July 2006, Eritrea's new ambassador to the U.S. was warned that he will have a hard time during his tenure in Washington, during a courtesy call to U.S. Undersecretary for Political Affairs. In January 2007, U.S. security officers at New York's JFK Airport conducted unlawful search on the person of Eritrea's ambassador to the United Nations. The ambassador was isolated from the other passengers and ordered to pass through a special search machine. His hand luggage was searched in a special spot, disregarding his diplomatic identification card. The security officer in charge informed the ambassador that the special search was an order from higher authorities. Furthermore, upon arrival in Asmara, the ambassador discovered that his baggage was forcefully opened and searched, without his approval and presence. A notice of inspection was inserted inside his baggage in acknowledgement of the act. This is in violation of Article 36 of the Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations, which clearly states, inspection shall be conducted in the presence of the diplomatic agent or of his authorized representative. In February 2007, the U.S. Embassy in Asmara wrote in Note Verbale No. 04607, the Embassy wishes to inform the government of the state of Eritrea that its continued failure to allow the unhindered entry of our diplomatic pouches, which contain items necessary for the full functioning of the mission, including materials vital to the issuance of the visas, has unduly interfered with embassy operations. Unless we are able to resolve this matter, effective February 14, the Embassy of the United States will close to the public and suspend all visa operations. In February 2007, U.S. Visa Revalidation Office in the State Department delayed the renewal of visa of the Deputy of Chief of Mission, DCM, in the Eritrean Embassy in Washington under the flimsy excuse of administrative review process. In May 2007, the U.S. Embassy in Asmara informed the Ministry of Foreign Affairs that the HIV/AIDS prevention program will be terminated on the 31st of May 2007. The termination of the program, which was incidentally very small compared to other countries in Africa, was again justified by the spurious pretext of permission obstacles to inspection trips. In June 2009, President Obama signed Executive Order 1349 putting Eritrea in the League of Human Trafficking Nations and imposing a series of financial sanctions against it. In reality, it was U.S. administrations that were willfully engaged in inducing human flight from Eritrea for reasons better known to them. In 2004, the U.S. government employed the services of the UNHCR to encourage the entire Kunama language group in Eritrea to seek and obtain asylum in the United States. Again in February 2009, the Bureau of Refugees in the State Department announced that it has allocated asylum rights for 10,000 Eritrean youth who may desert the national service. This act in fact violates U.S. laws against army deserters as well as undermining the elaborate extradition proceedings that the Pentagon routinely resorts to so as to bring to court U.S. Army deserters from Iraq and other war zones who seek asylum in third countries. The Obama administration continued until the end of its term the annual and offensive ritual of designating Eritrea as a country of concern for practicing religious persecution. Unlawful interference in the boundary demarcation process. The U.S. administration acted unlawfully to obstruct the demarcation of the boundary in accordance with the final and binding decisions of the Eritrea-Ethiopia Boundary Commission, EEBC. When Ethiopia's Prime Minister rejected, in September 2003, the EEBC award as illegal, irresponsible and unjust, and requested the UN Security Council to create an alternative mechanism, this was done in consultation and with the approval of the U.S. administration. The appointment of Lloyd Axworthy and the subsequent decision of the U.S. government to appoint General Fulford are, among other things, clear testimonies to the collusion between the United States and Ethiopia to alter the colonial boundary by circumventing the EEBC. Indeed, General Fulford, rather unwisely, wrote to Eritrea's legal counsel that he was seeking operational latitude to shift the boundary by about 1 kilometer. In her press statement in May 2007, the Assistant Secretary of State crowed about satellite technology to address the issues of some farms that would be split from their wells. It must be underlined that there are no mosques or churches that will be split into two. We are talking about a 1,000 kilometers borderline with no nightmarish scenarios. But above all, the litigation process was exhaustive and conducted over a 2-year period with the submission of voluminous memorials, counter-memorials, and hearings where all issues were argued out and trashed. In any case, if U.S. official position is the implementation of the final and binding award of the EEBC decision without any qualification, in accordance with the Algiers Agreement, the stance of the Assistant Secretary of State is at variance with her government's views. Ambassador John Bolton, former U.S. permanent representative to the UN, in his book, Surrender is Not an Option, Defending America at the United Nations notes, in regard to the border issue between Eritrea and Ethiopia. I certainly had no favorite, but it seemed that Eritrea had a point. Ethiopia had agreed on a mechanism to resolve the border dispute in 2000 and now was welching on its deal in flat violation of its commitments. I said we should solve the problem and not let it fester forever. France, Japan and several other council members agreed with me, for reasons I never understood. However, Fraser reversed course, and asked in early February to reopen the 2002 EEBC decision, which she had concluded was wrong, and award a major piece of disputed territory to Ethiopia. I was at a loss how to explain that to the Security Council. On a similar issue, Mr. Azuz Enifar, former acting special representative of the UNSG to Eritrea and Ethiopia, reported. I met on the 24th of June 2006 with Jendai Fraser, U.S. Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs in Addis Ababa. She regretted that the EEBC is not flexible. She told me that she has developed parallel tracks to deal with the matter. In her view, demarcation as Eritrea wants it is not feasible. She also said that the status quo would benefit Ethiopia and demarcation would not take place without dialogue. U.S. Embassy Berlin cable of the 11th of August 2009, similarly, reads, "We agreed that Ethiopia is an indispensable partner to stability in the region. The border conflict between Ethiopia and Eritrea is frozen for the foreseeable future." The United States has been instrumental in ensuring that UN Security Council resolutions are distorted to apportion equal blame to Eritrea and Ethiopia. At times, the US has even succeeded in portraying Eritrea as the culprit party. Ethiopia has rejected the EEBC decision, which should have been enforced by the UN Security Council. Yet to date, Ethiopia continues to occupy sovereign Eritrean territories in violation of the Algiers Peace Agreement, the Charter of the UN, as well as UN Security Council resolutions, adopted in 2002 requesting Ethiopia to dismantle settlements in the Badme area. All these issues have faded with time, and US leverage is being brought to bear on the UN Security Council so as to misdirect its punitive measures against Eritrea. In a confidential cable communication from the US Secretary of State issued on March 1, 2008, the US mission to the UN is instructed to canvass for support from certain Security Council members and UN troop contributing countries for sanctions against Eritrea, for its interference with UNMEE, especially its recent refusal to reinstate fuel supplies to the mission. The cable states, potential options include, I. Imposing a travel ban on key Eritrean government officials. E. Placing an assets freeze on these same officials and or other Eritrean assets, resources. E. Imposing trade, investment, or other restrictions related to Eritrean resources, including mining. IV. Imposing an arms embargo on Eritrea. US role in exacerbating the conflict with Djibouti. The United States and Ethiopia colluded to nudge Djibouti to fabricate a border dispute and falsely accuse Eritrea for military aggression against its small neighbor. Indeed, Djibouti-Eritrea relations were improving steadily even as the situation in Somalia was taking a turn for the worse in 2006. A 14th of September 2006 cable from the Embassy of France reports on a September 7, 8 meetings with U.S. Ambassador to Djibouti W. Stuart Symington and French officials, Hélène Legal and desk officer François Gautier. President Chirac's Africa advisor Michel de Bonacourse. And his deputy Jacques Champagne de Labraille. According to the cable, Djibouti had managed to maintain a balanced relationship with Ethiopia and Eritrea. The French noted that the possibility of social unrest existed in Djibouti, in part because income from the bases was not necessarily being distributed broadly. The widespread use of cat, a stimulant imported mainly from Ethiopia, was a significant factor in Djiboutian society. It had generally negative effects on the political process and economy. Social unrest was always possible when supplies of cat dwindled. Increasing numbers of Somalis, Eritreans, and Ethiopians were in Djibouti, attracted by Djibouti's port and the illusion that it would always provide more jobs, which was not the case. Ethnic tensions were growing in Djibouti. In a 16th of September 2006 cable, Ethiopia, Deputy Minister Tekeda talks Somalia, regional issues with Das Yamamoto. The Ethiopian Deputy Minister Tekeda Alamu tells the US official in Addis that he wants a break in Djibouti-Eritrea ties. The cable from US Ambassador Donald Yamamoto begins with this. Tekeda expressed concern about increasing Eritrean influence over Djibouti as well as CIC contacts with President Geller. He encouraged the USG to speak frankly with Djibouti about the risks of its behavior. Tekeda maintained that the God was on the wrong path, and added that Djibouti was not strong enough to take Ethiopia's continued friendship and forbearance for granted. But in February-March 2008, a putative Eritrea-Djibouti border dispute was deliberately escalated to advance the US-Ethiopia agenda against the state of Eritrea. The government of Djibouti unleashed an intensive campaign accusing Eritrea of deploying forward troops in the common border. This was not contested by the French government, as the following cable illustrates. French ambassador to Djibouti Dominique Decaf said that while he had to take note of the assertions by Djibouti's foreign minister, French military observers in the field had not seen any concentration of Eritrean troops along the border with Djibouti. He said French fixed-wing aircraft dispatched to the area on April 17 did not see anything conclusive, and did not see massive troop concentrations along the border. On the 12th of May 2008, France's position on the issue remained the same. A cable from the US Embassy in Paris reported the following. Le Gall said the Djiboutians had been phoning her 3 times a day, democracy and human rights. The United States has all along believed that its perceived strategies in the region can be better served by Ethiopia. Irrespective of the philosophical persuasions of the regime in power in Addis Ababa. This consistent and overriding policy was couched in Cold War terms in the 1950s. It was subsequently articulated in terms of regional, anchor states, as spelled out in the U.S. National Security Strategy of 2002. This policy did not serve the interests of Eritrea, Ethiopia, the region, and even the United States. Yet, it continued for 6 decades with damaging consequences. Eritrea hopes that now, it can be finally redressed, contributing to regional peace and security and promoting U.S. interests.